Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to Oblong Online. I'm Helen Seslowski, Events Director for Oblong Books. Before I welcome our wonderful guests this evening, I have a few instructions for you. If you have questions for our author, Elizabeth Kolbert, at any time during the presentation, you can type them into the chat, which you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can click the Ask a Question module at the bottom of your screen. Write them in there, and Joe will address them with Elizabeth after the conversation portion of the program. For those of you who've not yet read the book, who'd like to buy a signed copy of Under a White Sky, there's a Buy the Book button at the bottom of your screen, and we ship everywhere. For those of you who'd like to listen to your books, we've also added a link to purchase the audiobook, and you can find that at the top of the chat bar. So now it's my great pleasure to hand you over to our good friend Joe Donahue of WAMC Public Radio. Take it away, Joe. He'll introduce us to our author this evening, Elizabeth Kolbert.
Well, thank you, Helen. Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. It's a delight to be with you all. These virtual events are weird, but they're still fun in their own way, aren't they, Elizabeth? Like I don't know, they're still fun. They're not like being in a bookstore, but it's very nice that we can still do them. And I'm thrilled. Elizabeth has been a dear friend and a dear friend of our program for a long time, and obviously lives close, and it's just wonderful to have her here. So the way we're going to do this tonight is we're going to tape for the book show. So this will be an episode of the book show. We'll have a 30-minute conversation, and that'll be the show. And then when we're done, we'll go, and then that's when we'll go to the questions. So if you have a question now, you can certainly put it into the box and put it in the chat. If not, you can do it during or after in about a half hour or so when we go to those questions. So I will start off by doing an official introduction for the show, and then we'll get started. Sound good to you, Elizabeth?
Sounds good to me.
Excellent. It's so good to see you.
Likewise.
Everything good? Everything okay? Everything's fine?
Everything's okay here in Williamstown. Yeah.
Good.
So far, so good.
We'll keep it that way. All right, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the book show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Elizabeth Kolbert is a Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Sixth Extinction. She returns to humanity's transformative impact on the environment, now asking, after doing so much damage, can we change nature, this time to save it? What happens when human creations backfire? Well, Kolbert's new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, explores different nature-altering technologies, both in existence and in the abstract. This show is being recorded as part of a virtual author event with Oblong Books and Music. You can find them at oblongbooks.com. Elizabeth Kolbert is the co-author of Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate Change, and the Sixth Extinction, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. She also, of course, is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and it is a pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Kolbert back to the book show. How are you?
I'm okay, Joe. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a delight, as always, to see you. The new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. Let us start with the title, and this comes later in the book, well, the end of the book, really. But let me just say this at the beginning. I thought of this book could be taken both ways, right? It can either scare the hell out of you, or you can think to yourself, wow, there are these people doing these really amazing things that maybe will eventually scare the hell out of us. I don't know. You can read it both ways, can't you?
No, absolutely. And I think that people will find themselves, each chapter takes on a different intervention, if you will say, in the natural world, sort of ways that we're intervening to try to correct for previous interventions, some of which people will say, yes, that's absolutely true. Some of which already exist, are already happening. Some of which, as you say, are more sort of futuristic. And some of them you may well say, yeah, that's a great idea. And some of them you may say, that's the scariest thing I've ever heard of. And you may find yourself flipping back and forth between the two.
So when it comes to Under a White Sky, talk to us a little bit about how that title came about.
So as you suggest, it's a little bit of a spoiler here. It's the end of the book. For one of the last chapters in the book, I spent a bunch of time with scientists at Harvard who run something called the Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program. And the idea behind solar geoengineering is that we've already, changed the atmosphere very dramatically. And now we might, by loading it up with carbon dioxide, warming the climate. And one of the real challenges for dealing with climate change is that it's very hard to do something about it quickly because carbon dioxide hangs around in the atmosphere for a long time. So if you get a climate that you don't care for, that really is dangerous, and unfortunately we may be heading there, one of the few ideas that people have come up with for how you could arrest climate change is by intervening again in the stratosphere, putting up particles into the stratosphere that would reflect sunlight back to space, bounce sunlight back out to space, and actually reduce the amount of direct sunlight that hits the Earth. That would have a pretty immediate cooling effect that theoretically, at least, could counter the warming effect. And one of the many, many potential side effects that this intervention could have is it could change the appearance of the sky. So instead of, if you went somewhere where nowadays you would expect a pretty unpolluted part of the world where you would expect to find a bright blue sky on a sunny day, the sky would have sort of a milky tinge. And that's the source of the title, Under a White Sky.
Under a White Sky, the nature of the future. So when it comes to these interventions, and often interventions to deal with interventions, this becomes obvious in the book, obviously, but I'm curious as to your take on it of do these usually come from a good place in the beginning?
Yes. I mean, I think in all of the cases that I talk about, either people thought they were doing something, good, or they were just unconscious. I mean, climate change is the unwitting impact of our leading modern lives, driving around, flying around, heating our homes with fossil fuels. So, no one intended climate change, but it sure is happening. Some of the other interventions I talk about in the book are, for example, people introduce species into different parts of the world that turned out to wreak havoc, but their intentions at the beginning were good.
So let's talk about you read about New Orleans in the book, and so you can tell us what happens there, but obviously you have an area that is being besieged. It is having difficulty. We know this from Katrina. We know this from a lifetime plus of storms and damage, and so we work like hell to try to fix it. And while we're doing that, well, New Orleans is disappearing.
Well, I think that's a very stark and, sort of clear example of this phenomenon that I'm talking about, where, New Orleans sits on a delta that naturally over time, as the Mississippi created the land that New Orleans is on. It used to overflow its banks every spring, basically. It would deposit a lot of sediment across the landscape. That's how all of the Mississippi Delta was created. And over time, these different, what are called delta lobes, would sink away, and a new lobe would be created. But we built, New Orleans on this delta lobe, and now we have to try to protect it. And the way we've tried to protect it is by preventing the Mississippi from flooding. Now, by preventing the Mississippi from flooding, all the incredible waterworks, the levees, the flood walls that keep the Mississippi in its banks, they have had the unintended side effect of preventing new sediment from spilling across the landscape. So all of southern Louisiana is disappearing very fast. It's said that southern Louisiana loses a football field's worth of land every 90 minutes. And New Orleans is one of the fastest sinking places on Earth. So the new sort of intervention to deal with the intervention is to try to now create controlled flooding, to basically open up these cracks in the crevasses, they're called, in the levees, that will themselves be controlled. And then you'll let out this water when there's a lot of sediment. And you will try to, as I say, create this controlled flooding to counteract the effects of flood control.
Does this become an ever-ending cycle in this case? I mean, because it's possible, if nothing is done, that New Orleans could just wash away, right? So you do this, but then you have to wonder, and I'm sure obviously minds are thinking about this, but then what damage is that doing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's, New Orleans has grown up in a what really would be a temporary part of the world. And now as you try I mean, another case of this, for example, is we're constantly pumping water out of New Orleans. New Orleans is basically beneath sea level. So we're always pumping. When rain falls in New Orleans, you have to pump it out. That pumping also has the effect of, fostering this subsidence, this sinking. So everything that we do to sort of try to keep New Orleans from going under has the effect, is a double-edged sword, unfortunately.
And that's the case with many of the stories that you tell in the book, that there is a double-edged sword to it, right? Either it started that way or that's where we are now. Yes,
and I think that one of the sort of messages and themes of the book is these systems are very complicated, and you sort of draw a line here and say this is what we're trying to do, but a lot of the system is a lot more complicated than that. It's not just an on-off system. There's a lot going on. And so, for example, in southern Louisiana, the whole area is referred to as a coupled human and natural system, or a CHANS. It's this interconnected way in which our own engineering and the geology of the region have now become so intertwined that you can't really tell where human engineering and the natural world, where the human engineering ends and the natural world begins.
And it's hard to figure out where one begins and the other ends, and where the other ends and the other begins. But I also get back to this idea of what is good and bad, and the idea of, for want of a better term, playing God, and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, that comes up pretty explicitly in the book. I allude to that quote, pretty famous quote from Stuart Brand, we are as gods and have to get good at it.
Right.
Which has, been countered by people like E.O. Wilson, who will say, well, unfortunately, we're not as gods. We're pretty incompetent. And then also by a British writer, Paul Kingsnorth, who makes the point, who argues we are as gods and we're pretty bad at it. We're very destructive gods. So all of these perspectives are out there, and I think there's truth to all of them. I mean, we obviously exercise tremendous influence on the natural world. We live in this geological epoch that has been dubbed the Anthropocene, the age of man. We
Right.
now, definitely equal many of the great forces of nature in our impacts on the world. And, are we just wreaking havoc? Are we just kind of like, the gods in the myth who, tromp around and mere mortals get destroyed, or are we going to wise up, I suppose? Can we wise up? Can we ever intervene in these systems, which are so complicated, which predate us, which took, billions of years to evolve through a process of trial and error? Can we intervene in them using, human ingenuity in a way where we can anticipate all of the after effects? And that's, I think, really the big question of our time right now.
Because as you go through the world and talk to these various people and tell us these stories of what they are up to intervene in one way or another, they have the chance perhaps of being a god. But you as the author don't think of it that way. You obviously are looking at it saying, okay, but well, what else could happen?
Well, let's take it. Let's take an example that's reasonably close to home. So one of the sort of the center of the book deals with gene editing, which has
Yeah.
become, a lot easier and a lot cheaper owing to CRISPR. And I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with that. So CRISPR is just a suite of gene editing techniques that have really revolutionized gene editing, made it possible. I mean, in the book, I buy a kit and I gene edit some bacteria in my kitchen, so it's really kind of incredible. And people are looking at using gene editing to try to save species. That's probably possible. For example, we have a pretty good example right here, in New York State, where scientists in Syracuse have developed a chestnut tree, an American chestnut tree that is immune to chestnut blight or resistant to chestnut blight. And that involves importing a single gene from wheat into that tree. Now, those trees, I've seen those trees. They're sitting in fence plots because they need federal permits to allow them to be planted out in the world. Now, do we want to have, chestnut trees, transgenic chestnut trees? They will not be exactly like the originals, but they'll be pretty close. But, gene editing species raises a lot of very profound, ethical and scientific questions. So do we want a world in which we are tinkering with the genomes of all the creatures around us? If that's the only way to save a species, would we be willing to do that? So these are huge questions looming over us, and they really do, to many people's minds, and I think we're getting pretty close to asking the question of, yes, who gets to decide? This is a conscious decision of which species we manipulate and which one gets to survive. Now, I would argue we are unconsciously, unwittingly, just willy-nilly doing that all the time. So the question is, as Stuart Brand said, are we going to get good at this?
Right. You have a chapter in the book on carbon dioxide removal, and it seems that you find this to be one of the promising things that you've looked at, but the jury's still out, obviously.
Yeah, so carbon dioxide removal is a pretty interesting one because we've sort of already factored it into, when people say, let's keep the average global temperature below, 2 degrees Celsius. Let's keep it from rising above more than 2 degrees Celsius. In sort of already built into that is, can we remove carbon? Because we're sort of probably going to go over that. Are we going to be able to take some of that carbon out of the air? So there's a lot resting on whether we can do that because we're already counting to a certain. And there are a lot of ways you could take carbon out of the air, but to do it at scale, to do it at a meaningful scale, is really quite difficult. Something that I talk about in the book. I actually went to visit some of my emissions that had been scrubbed out of the air. I went to a place in Iceland where they suck carbon out of the air and shove it underground, and it turns to stone. It was a really interesting trip, a fascinating trip. Now, can you do that, at scale where you're doing billions and billions of tons a year? That is a question that remains to be answered.
You write about that very simply in the book, as if you get an email and you're like, well, sign me up for this. I'm in. And then the next thing you know, you've rented a car and you're driving through Iceland, which I just think I'm sure it was more complicated than that, but you get.
Well, also a point that I make in the book is, as soon as I got on that plane to go to Iceland, I sort of negated the value of having had them take my emissions from there because I was creating more emissions, so it's the math is very, very punishing.
I want to get back to the gene editing for a minute, and just because it brings us back to some of these technologies that we've been talking about, some of them being promising, but some of them just being downright scary too, and think about what can be done, and that obviously is one example of um, even is it solar geoengineering that you talk about? I mean, some of this can be frightening.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two sort of, most, um, the two technologies that really raise the biggest questions in the book are a form of gene editing that's called gene drive, where you are not only editing a creature, but you're editing its you're sort of programming a creature to gene edit itself. And so you can really take a trait and push it out into the world. And there are already these mosquitoes that have been edited with a gene drive. The idea of the gene drive is to basically spread a trait that makes it very hard for these mosquitoes to reproduce, so to fight malaria. Now, if you let those mosquitoes out in the world, are you going to sort of get rid of every mosquito in the world? That is a very interesting question, an important question. Maybe people would like to get rid of mosquitoes, but it does raise a lot of questions. And the other one I think that really, freaks people out, and reasonably so, is solar geoengineering. Are we really going to, dim the sun? That is really what the technology would do.
Isn't Elizabeth Kolbert is our guest, by the way. The new book is Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, and it is published by Crown. Isn't what we're living through right now, this global pandemic, really part of what we're talking about, in the sense of you have this natural thing that is a virus, and it then goes into a species, and because of the way we live, it becomes global, and then we can't stop it because it goes everywhere immediately. So then we think, okay, it's everywhere. Well, now let's try to fix it. And that fix, of course, is a vaccine. And as we're figuring that out, oh, by the way, the virus is changing, and all of these variants are happening. And I don't know, last count, I think we're up to 3 boosters we're going to need, and that's as of today. So, but that plays into exactly what you're talking about in the book, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think COVID is a classic example of, how we deal with these problems that are sort of coupled human and natural systems, right? So as you suggest, these spillover events where a virus jumps species, that's what happened. That's how COVID got into the human population. It came from some other species, we don't know which at this point. And it jumped into the human population. And then because of the way we live in a globalized world, right, spillover events have happened throughout history. But because of the way humans live in 2020, it was immediately everywhere. It was in the Falkland Islands very quickly. So it was everywhere. And then even then, we could have taken steps to really try to tamp it down, control it very vigorously. We would have had to all stay home, under complete lockdown. We didn't do that. We let it just rage completely out of control. And then, as you say, we are now waiting for a techno fix. That's a vaccine,
right,
which was developed using cutting edge technology, these mRNA vaccines, really cutting edge. But meanwhile, the virus has ideas of its own, and it is mutating very fast because it is everywhere, because it is so widespread now. It has many, many, possibilities to evolve in many, many different people and recombine. And so, as you say, we're seeing the potential for what's called vaccine escape, and where we'll need constant vaccines, and where the disease, where COVID, I think, will become endemic. So it's just going to always be around, like the flu. It's just something we're never not going to be living with. And that is very much the situation, that I'm talking about, where, we don't do the social kinds of things that we might do to keep something under control. We let it get out of control, and then we sit here and say, okay, we're going to have to do something really radical, perhaps dim the sun to deal with it.
You know, this is probably a bad segue, but I have to say that in coming on these very big issues that we've been talking about, that as I say at the beginning of each book show, that this is a show about reading and writers. And you do a masterful job in this, because this book is really funny. I find it, well, it is, you know, it's scary stuff, it's important stuff, but it is a dark comedy, and you seem to have a twinkle in your eye as you're writing it, because it's beautifully done in a way that's like, okay, and then this happened.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I know this stuff is really heavy, and it sometimes sounds like the book, you know, is really heavy sledding, and I hope it isn't. It was fun to write. I know that sounds weird. It was fun. I had great adventures, and I hope the kind of absurdity, and as you say, the dark comedy of our situation, as opposed to just the depressing aspects of it, also come through in the book.
And it's sort of all we have, right? I mean, we have to sort of kind of sit back and just watch it unfold and see what happens.
Yes, I mean, I think that, you know, one of my own personal favorite, you know, social bits of social commentary, let's call it that, is Dr. Strangelove, which is, you know, as everyone knows, a hilarious movie about just about the heaviest subject, you know, there could be, nuclear holocaust. So I do think that, you know, dark comedy often does get at really important issues that are very hard for people to, you know, to read about if it's just unrelentingly grim.
So we have limited time, so I just want to get to two issues here real quick. One, tell me about Ruth Gates and the who passed away as you were writing this book, but the amazing project and what ultimately brought you to the Great Coral Reef.
So Ruth Gates was a very wonderful, dynamic woman, a marine scientist, and that was really the origins of the book. Was her project. She was working on something that became nicknamed the Supercoral Project, and I went to visit that about 4 years ago in Hawaii. And the idea behind the Supercoral Project was, you know, owing to climate change, owing to having dumped billions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, that we have altered the oceans really dramatically. Both their temperature is increasing, and also their chemistry is changing. And reefs, we know that one group of organisms that really isn't doing well in the oceans of today, so not even the oceans of the future, but the oceans of today, is reef-building corals, these tiny gelatinous animals that build reefs. And so Ruth's point with this project was, if you want reefs to survive the 21st century, and they're ecologically extremely important, you know, coral reefs, then we're going to have to intervene again. We've already, you know, intervened in the oceans. We've already changed the oceans. We're going to have to now try to change these corals to enable them to survive this changed ocean. And that idea that, you know, you have to intervene on top of an intervention, that really struck me as sort of a new chapter, as it were, in our long and complicated relationship to the natural world. And I really started to see, you know, Ruth made a big impression on me. And as I say, she's very smart, very dynamic, very charismatic. And I started to sort of see this pattern all around me, and that sort of became the genesis of the book.
And what you won't do for a good story for the book, but you actually got hit by an Asian carp.
Yes. The book begins, we're on a trip down what's called the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, and it's actually a man-made waterway that was designed to changed the direction of the Chicago River, which used to flow into Lake Michigan and now flows out of Lake Michigan, so that Chicago's sewage is not dumped into Lake Michigan, which is the source of Chicago's drinking water. But that project had the unintended consequence, you're sort of getting the theme here, of joining together the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed. And Asian carp, which are a highly invasive species, actually several species, are working their way toward the Great Lakes. And so I took a trip down this canal to a portion of the canal that is now electrified. Literally, if you went into the water, you could probably kill yourself, to try to keep the carp, to try to dissuade the carp from moving from the Mississippi system into the Great Lakes. And on another trip to Illinois, I managed to get myself hit by an Asian carp, which have the unfortunate habit of flinging themselves out of the water. And they're really big fish. They're like 80 pounds. So I got hit in the leg, and it was painful, but it was no big deal. But I met people who'd had their eye sockets broken. I mean, really, they are very, very, that can be really dangerous if you get hit by a flying Asian carp.
We also learn about what a Chicago River whitefish is.
Yes, but I'm not sure I'm going to say that on the air, Jim.
Okay. Well, it's on the second page of the book, so people can find it there. Elizabeth, it's always a great pleasure to have you on the program. The name of the new book is Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. The book is published by Crown. I thank you so much, as always, for you being here.
Thanks, Joe.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. This show recorded as part of a virtual author event with Oblong Books and Music, oblongbooks.com. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue. Excellent. That was fun.
Indeed, that was great.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much for doing it. We have a lot of questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Hit me.
Let me open up the question vault here. See, I've never used Crowdcast before. This is interesting that people can vote on the questions. I like that. Oh, the poor schnook who has like no votes. How does that work? All right. I've never seen that before. That's fascinating. Okay, so Leo writes and says, how immediate in the future are the more abstract ideas set in?
Well, that's up to us to a certain extent. I mean, I think that there's nothing in the book that is really technologically beyond us. Gene editing, gene drive, all of those things are possible. Geoengineering, solar geoengineering, I think people believe is not a big technological, reach, that we could definitely do it if we set our minds to it within, a matter of years. So there's nothing that's very futuristic. I think the question is, in all of these cases, and particularly the cases of things that people find alarming, let's put it that way, whether, politically we want to do them. And then the question of who gets to decide. So there's a lot of questions there, but they're not big technological reaches. There's nothing in the book that's terribly, that's beyond the horizon technologically.
We have this question from Susan, who writes and says, we tend to assume that there is a fundamental division between the idea of the human and the idea of nature. Can you speak to the fact that human beings are part of nature? We are as natural a phenomenon as anything we call nature. Is it natural for people to behave this way?
Well, that's a really good question, Susan. I think, humans are not the first species to radically change the world. The first species to radically change the world were the bacteria that had invented, photosynthesis 2 billion years ago and oxygenated the atmosphere. And that was a huge change for life on Earth. But since then, most animals and plants have had limited impact on, the functioning of planet Earth until you get to people who have this ability to not wait for evolutionary change in order to do something new, right? We just change very quickly. If we need to find a new technology, even our Stone Age ancestors were very, very good at doing that. And they succeeded as a result in already doing in a lot of large animals. Why don't we have mammoths anymore in New York State? Why don't we have mastodons? I think it's pretty clear. There's still some debate about this, but I think it's pretty clear that it was because people did them in. They were very slow to reproduce, and they just eventually couldn't keep up with the rate at which they were being killed. So the distinction between the human and the natural is, yes, we are a product of evolution just as everything else is, but we have also sort of left that evolutionary trajectory. And that is exactly what makes us so dangerous. So, we could describe what we're doing as natural, or we could say it's completely unnatural. Either way, though, it's very, very dangerous to other species. I refer to, a book called The Sixth Extinction, and it's quite possibly very dangerous to ourselves. And that's what we're really starting to realize.
Sam writes and says, what might a world after geoengineered climate mitigation look like? Are events like the current climate-driven cold snap here to stay, or is there a possibility to turn back the clock to a global climate that we have already left?
Well, I mean, that's a really big question. And there are two things to get to the climate that we have left in a foreseeable time frame, right? Like, so eventually, all the CO2 that we put up there will eventually be drawn down, but eventually is a very long time, hundreds of thousands of years. So if we wanted to get back to a sort of a pre-industrial climate, in a foreseeable future, we would have to, and these are things I talk about in the book, you'd have to take a lot of CO2 out of the air, because CO2 hangs around for a long time. It's not going away once we put it up there. So you'd have to do a lot of carbon dioxide removal. And then you might also have to intervene, to counteract climate change with some form of, reflecting sunlight. So to get the pre-industrial climate of the world is not something that's going to happen without a lot more intervention. If you just, even if we stop emitting CO2 tomorrow, which, we absolutely should, that's just not making the problem worse. It's not getting us back to the climate that we had.
David has a good question that I touched on in the interview, but I didn't get to it fully, and he does, which is ultimately the questions about these interventions. Who ultimately decides to go ahead with them, and who makes that decision, even if you know what the risks are?
Well, that is a really good question. I agree. I think that the honest answer would be we don't have that answer yet. Now, in the case of genetically modified organisms, that decision has been tended to be made at a national level, right? So that chestnut tree that I refer to, that transgenic chestnut tree, right, that's awaiting permitting, that's awaiting federal permitting from the FDA, maybe also the EPA. In Australia, I visited scientists who were working on gene editing cane toads. If they wanted to release those gene edited organisms, these were in a lab. If they wanted to release them, they were going to have to get permits from the Australian government. But for something like solar geoengineering, there are these initiatives, and you can go online and find them. They're about what would governance of that look like if we ever decided once again, who's we? You could imagine it under the aegis of the UN, perhaps. But it's very hard to imagine exactly how that decision would get made. And that's why people do worry, for example, about, one or two countries, very powerful countries that have to be countries with a good air force, that they could just decide to do it on their own, and that is possible.
Judith writes and says, is it our denial of our mortality, our denial of death, that results in human nature bringing about that very thing upon ourselves? And Jude, that was a beautifully written question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very interesting question. I mean, I think that what has happened, why we're seeing these tremendous impacts of humanity, now in 2021, is a product of a kind of a long arc of history, but really ramped up post World War II. If you go look on, there's a project called the Great Acceleration, which I commend to people's attention, and it just has all these graphs of post World War II, what has happened in terms of fossil fuel use, human consumption of all sorts of primary goods, basic resources, water consumption, how many people there are on the planet, how much nitrogen fertilizer we use. So all of these things have just ramped up incredibly since 1950, basically. And the question of, how and why, those are huge questions. But now we're being left to grapple with the consequences of that. And, certainly how many of us there are on the planet and how much we consume, those are the big factors in what's going on. And, do we want to trace that back to our denial of our own mortality? I don't know. Or is it just that, we figured out ways to make life a lot easier for ourselves? We've availed ourselves of that in the form of using a lot of energy, for example, using a lot of resources. And now we're finding that has consequences that we really don't like.
We have two more questions that I'd like to get to. One is from Leo, who says, how many of these climate changing ideas require international cooperation, which gets to an earlier question about who decides?
Well, that's a very good question. So, carbon dioxide removal, which I think people are going to hear, people who are listening in tonight are going to hear more and more about over the next, for the rest of our lives, because it's really crucial in a lot of ways. That is something that could be done on a very local level. I could put up a machine that suck carbon out of the air. I could plant a lot of trees. Those decisions could be made, quite locally. But other decisions, another question is who's doing the accounting for that. That's another interesting issue. A lot of these technologies are useful only insofar as they're really effective. And, there's been many cases in which people, say that this is fighting climate change, that's fighting climate change, but who's really doing the math here? So that's a big accounting question that will have to be answered, not so much a governance question. For other issues, the governance issues are, as we discussed, they're tremendous. They're global governance issues, and we've proved over and over again, and climate change is pretty much exhibit A on that we're not very good at global governance.
Susan asked this question, which I think is a good one, and I saved it for the end, which is she was a big fan of Sixth Extinction, and wondered if you consider this book to be a sequel to that book, and if so, then how do you follow up this book?
Well, that's another good question, Susan. I do think it's a sequel in a lot of ways. It takes up this question of human impacts on the planet. It takes it to the next step of, the Sixth Extinction raised the point, not my own point, the point, that I took from a lot of scientific literature, that changing the planet has this unfortunate consequence for other creatures who just can't keep up with the rate of change that we are inflicting, as it were, on the planet. And then, this book sort of takes up this question, okay, as we come to the realization that a lot of these ways in which we're changing the planet have consequences for other species in some cases, or for ourselves that we don't care for, what are we going to do? And that leads you, pretty quickly, unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, into some pretty crazy territory. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. That's, part of the humor that Joe talked about. A lot of this stuff is it sounds crazy, it sounds wacky, but this is a situation that we've gotten ourselves into. And, there are even wackier ideas out there that I, didn't even take up, but could have. How's that? So everything that I discuss in the book is a proposal, or is either already happening, it's in the engineering phase, or it's a proposal from very serious scientists. It's not just some, mad guy in his garage. So I really tried to keep the book to very serious proposals. But as I say, there are lots of other proposals out there that, maybe one day we will be taking seriously. How's that?
Well, the book is fascinating and beautiful, and as I said, and just a lot of fun to read, and just endlessly interesting. Again, the name of the new book is Under a White Sky: The Nature of the Future. There's a tab at the bottom there that says "Buy the book." For goodness sakes, you got in here for free. Buy a book. That's how it's a wonderful place to stay alive. Oblong Books and Music is one of my favorite bookstores in the entire world, and the work they do is just tremendous and phenomenal. And any way that you can help them during this time, please do. Elizabeth, what a great pleasure. Thank you so much. Just a delight as always.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to Oblong Books.
Yes, indeed. And Helen, I'll throw it back to you, but thank you so much, and thank you for having us be a part of the conversation. Just a lovely evening. Thank you very much.
Well, it's been our pleasure, and thank you both for such a wonderful evening and an extremely interesting conversation. And I encourage everyone to listen in to The Book Show on NPR and listen to WAMC Radio and pick up a copy of Under a White Sky. Elizabeth, Joe, thank you very much for a wonderful evening. And thank you all
very much.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.